I was 8 years old when we first moved into the house on the edge of the forest. My parents had their doubts about buying a house with a backyard bordered by forest. They had their concerns about wild animals getting into our bins or hurting our dogs, and we were worried that one of us might wander too far into the trees and get lost. But it was cheap. My dad liked the seclusion, my mom loved the house itself. My siblings and I were excited about playing in the backyard and exploring the forest. Our first sign that something wasn't right was that our dogs were absolutely terrified of the forest. They never went into the forest for any reason. If a toy they'd been playing with found its way past the tree line, they would refuse to retrieve it. And when one of us went in, they would pace anxiously until we returned. On occasion, we noticed the dogs staring at a spot in the forest in obvious distress, sometimes growling or barking, but we could never see anything there. My brother once carried one of our dogs into the trees to show her there was nothing there, but she wriggled out of his grip and sprinted into the house in a panic. If someone were in the backyard when it was getting dark, we sometimes heard noises like someone was walking in the forest, sticks crunching underfoot, branches being pushed aside. If we called out, there was no response, but if we shined a flashlight around, we would occasionally catch a glimpse, just for a split second, of something that we could swear looked like a person walking around in the dark. My parents quickly banned us from entering the forest at all after dark, and even during the day we weren't allowed to go out of sight of the house. My sister's bedroom looked out at the backyard and the forest beyond, and she remembers looking out her window one night and seeing a shadowy figure standing right at the edge of the backyard. She says there's something wrong with it, like it wasn't quite standing on the ground and it was a little too tall to be a person, and it was sort of distorted, and she was convinced it was staring at her. She called for our dad, saying there's a man in the yard staring through a window, and when he ran outside to chase off whoever it was, she continued to watch the figure. It didn't move away, but when the light from her dad's flashlight passed over it, it just suddenly wasn't there anymore. We regularly heard knocks at the back door at night, with no one there. Our parents thought it was teenagers playing pranks, and stopped bothering even opening the door, until one rainy night when the knocking was persistent and agitated. My mom pointed out there might be someone needing shelter from the heavy rain outside, but when she opened the door, there was not only no one there, but there were no wet footprints on the porch. The knocking continued the whole time we lived there. It would happen several times in the span of a few weeks, then stop for months, then it'd start up again. My parents eventually installed a security camera, and there was never anyone at the door. The camera wasn't all useless, though. About 3 years into living there, my brother started having night terrors and sleepwalking. When he went sleepwalking, he would always go out the back door and start walking towards the forest. My mom, being a light sleeper, would hear the door open and run out to get him before he made it into the forest. After the third or fourth time it happened, my brother asked to see the camera footage, because he wanted to see how he looked like when he was sleepwalking. I guess thinking it would look funny. The footage showed him walking out onto the porch, then pausing as if listening to something, and shaking his head, then reluctantly walking forward as if being pulled or forcefully guided by something. One evening, my dad was in the backyard and he heard my sister calling him from the forest, seemingly in distress. Thinking she'd gone exploring in the forest and fallen over and hurt herself, he ran in and started calling to her, but quickly realized it was too dark to see her, and he couldn't pinpoint where her voice was coming from. He told her to wait while he grabbed a flashlight. When he ran back into the house for the flashlight, he saw my sister inside, safe and completely unconcerned. At the time, my dad hadn't told us about hearing my sister's voice in the forest, so when I heard my mom's voice coming from the forest months later, while I was outside with the dogs one evening, I didn't question it, despite the fact I'd seen my mom inside recently and hadn't noticed her walk past me. My mom was calling to me, saying she'd gotten her sweater caught in some branches and needed me to come help her. As I walked in, the dog started barking, alerting my dad, who saw me through the window, wandering into the forest. He came outside, called me, and said I was just helping Mom. He yelled back that Mom was inside and needed to run back to the house as fast as I could, which I did. After this, my parents had built a fence around the backyard and started looking for a new place. In the meantime, between the fence being built and us moving out, it got way worse. We'd hear knocking at the door more regularly, as well as tapping on the windows as if someone was walking the perimeter of the house trying to get into every window. We'd often hear scratching and scraping sounds on the fence, and voices beyond it. My brother's night terrors got more frequent, and one night my mom didn't hear the door open when he went sleepwalking. He woke up standing at the fence, staring into the forest with the dogs barking at him. Last morning we spent there, less than 4 years after we moved in, we woke up to find the back door fully open, and the security camera showed it slowly swing open on its own. Since moving out, my brother's sleepwalking has stopped, though he still gets night terrors and has suffered from pretty severe anxiety. A few nights ago, he called me out of the blue, and after a bit of small talk, he asked me if I think the door being opened that final night means whatever was out there finally got in. He was trying to make light of it, saying he had gotten in the spirit of Halloween, joking about how we should maybe all get exercise just in case something latched onto us all those years ago. But I think he's deeply bothered by everything that happened. I know I am, still a little. I still get nervous around dark wooded areas. I don't know what I think was out there in the forest behind our house at night, but I get the feeling that given the chance, it would have swallowed us whole. I grew up in a rural forested area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, I was around 10 at the time, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened upon was a very rare find and had the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide enough and deep enough to swim around in and had a nice, soft, mossy bank on either side to rest after we had tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads and no mosquitoes because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch the next day so we could have a picnic by the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning, we set out for the woods around 1 p.m., planning to have a picnic first and then swim. We entered at the same spot we had the day previously and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before, so being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around here for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked, the woods started feeling darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about half an hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an old and overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, and bathtub all sitting arranged in the woods together, just covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird shit like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked down and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home or out of the woods at least. I told her we should follow the sun and we eventually would come upon a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way and we began yelling at each other out of fear, and let's be honest, little girl boxiness. I told her if she thought she was so right we should just go her way and we would see who got out first, so we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend deciding to go my way after all, I slowed down so she can catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was, it matched my pace. I slow down, it slowed down. I stop, it stops. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head or there was something really following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy enough if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came upon something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun west the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and just screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground as I tried to collect myself. I heard the footsteps again, walking upon me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could. No one answered. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now this is the truly horrifying part, which I typically omit when telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to the darkest, deepest cloud I've ever seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black it looked like I was looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it just seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sounds of bells were coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sensation of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away, whatever the hell this cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run towards the thing chasing behind me either, though, so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour. until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard I realized all the air in my lungs had been knocked out of me. As I lay there, trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark and I realized what had made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough it did. I walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained where it happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered in head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my whole life, but I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split up, and figured I had as well, so I hadn't told anybody I was lost. My family just figured I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in all beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late.